Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay. This is a podcast to inspire, uplift, show forth the love of God, and help usher in the spiritual awakening. Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay. I'm your host, Jay Spillers. I have AJ back. This is part 2, and we're going to do some more discussion. So, you were talking about how mindfulness is part of what we're ultimately doing as in terms of becoming one. That we want to be in the present moment. Isn't that sort of like what the NDE is? You're always in the present moment. When you're on the other side.
Well, yes. What they say about the other side is that there is no time. But actually, when you stop thinking or when you stop using your verbal thinking, your thinking mind, you actually become aware of the present moment. So, mindfulness is basically being alert, being experiencing the now in its fullest. Most of the times when we are when we are going through life, we're thinking about other things. We may be somewhere, for example, you're here, but you're thinking about something that you have to do later or something that you did before. So, actually experiencing the present moment is really hard. In NDEs, I have been told, since I have not experienced one, but I have interviewed many people who have, there is a sense of a timeless existence. So, but this teaching about mindfulness, I gathered it from the teachings of most ancient religions. Uh, there seems to be, let's say, there are two worlds: the real world and the world we imagine or we think it is. For example, a tree is not a tree. If you look at a tree and you say the word tree, you're intellectualizing the whole thing. So, to experience, like I explained in our last session, if you experience water, if you are washing your hands, and you think, I'm washing my hands with water, that's not really what's going on. If you concentrate on the experience and stop thinking and simply sink into the feeling, into the experience, that is reality. So many times it could be compared to when you go to a wonderful place, and the first thing you do is you take out your phone and start taking pictures. Instead of enjoying the present moment, you are doing something else. So that's what we do mostly. So I explained also that the this oneness or God cannot be imagined, cannot be expressed in words. It is an abstract being, but this word being is not a noun. Normally, when we say being, human being is a noun, but the act of being, the verb being here, not a being, but being here, that word being, that's what it's all about. And that word being means mindfulness also. It is the act of actually being in the present moment. And God is basically life, love, being, and also ultimate wisdom and ultimate information. Many people describe this universe as an informational universe. They say that everything is information, codified, like in our DNAs. So some people define this universe or the essence of the universe as numerical or mathematical, but it's basically information, you know. So it's really hard to explain or express. And every time we try to explain or express it, we are making a mistake because my definition will not be the same as yours. And that's why in the world there are so many different concepts of God. This is something that comes out when I have been studying different near death experiencers. They each have their own version of divinity or of the place they went. Many do go to a place, those who have heavenly experiences, they go to a place where it looks like a meadow with trees. They may or may not be a river in the middle that you are not allowed to cross, but there is always some sort of boundary. However, other people see it differently, completely different. So there is not an unique perception of, let's call it the other side. Each time I interview someone, that person will, comes up with a different description, a different explanation of what happened. Especially when they talk about deities or divine beings or beings of light. Some of them describe them one way, and others describe them in other ways. So what I have, my conclusion is that we each have to interpret that those other dimensions in a 3D way, limited by our 3D perception. So we all we do is translate into what our senses allow us to uh, to perceive in a unique way and very personal way. It is subjective, almost like in dreams. And this is why I mentioned also that when Carl Jung studied mystical dreams and mystical visions, he said that there were archetypes and that each individual perceives each archetype in a different way. For example, God is an archetype, and everyone will perceive it in its own way. Jesus is another archetype, and we each perceive it in our own different way. But it's all because we are in living in this 3D world. And one example that is very interesting is that if we lived in a 2D world, we would see everything as flat, everything as lines and squares, and everything would be flat, okay? There would be no depth. So a chair would be either a line or a square, and it would not look like a chair. So that same chair that we see in 3D, when we go to higher dimensions, we will see it in a way that we cannot describe it here. For example, you would be able to see the chair from below, from above, from the right, from the left, from every side at once. Okay? That would be one way of translating these other dimensions, but they cannot be expressed just like uh, someone who lives in the 2D world cannot express or cannot understand 3D. You see? So basically, what I grew interested in was trying to make sense of the different religions, why each religion is so different than the rest, but in the same time or simultaneously, they do have common roots. Most true religions talk about love, talk about uh, oneness, talk about this inner peace, talk about a creator or a higher source. It can be Mother Nature, it can be God. It has many names, okay? But they're a superior being and beings. And they also talk about life after death. Everyone in their own way, you know. So there were certain things that drew my attention. One was that these religions, why are they so different? I concluded that it's because these mystical experiences that gave birth to religion are so different in each individual because we are limited by 3D and all that. So the origins of the religions were spiritually transformative experiences, mystical experiences, and when the founders of the religions or when their followers tried to explain everything in words, they made a big mistake. For example, this is why Jesus or Buddha, Krishna, none of them wrote anything. They used parables. You see, this is why Jesus spoke in parables, because he knew that you cannot really talk about those things without limiting our minds. What happened after Jesus left? They took his teachings, they wrote them down, they created rules, they said this and that, they created temples with his image or without his image. But Jesus never preached in a temple. He was out. He was always, walking, going from town to town, preaching outside. And it could be on a hill, or it could be on a lake, on top of a boat. There was no need for sacrifice. There was no need for uh, communion. He did have a Last Supper, and that's what they tried to uh, honor when they started. His followers started celebrating a supper. Okay, but it was not like people think now. It was not a ceremony. You see, it was simply a practice
Mm-hmm.
that it started out without priests, without bishops, without any of those ranks. So as soon as Jesus died, everything changed. They started writing his teachings. They started creating rules. They started dividing themselves into groups, and the original message was lost. The same thing happened with Buddha. Buddha did not write anything. His his discourses were written many years after he died. The same happened with Jesus and also Krishna, and also most of the main religious teachers, Moses, Abraham. None of them wrote directly their teachings, and when they did, they wrote them in parables or in metaphorical stories. Like, for example, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Noah, the story of the Tower of Babel. Those were not historic events, but metaphors with symbolic teachings for those interested in, in learning what they call the secret teachings. Jesus said, "Don't throw pearls to the pigs because they may stand against you and harm you." Don't remember the exact words, but what he meant is that this teaching of oneness goes beyond good and evil, goes beyond norms, goes beyond good and bad. So it is sacred, but at the same time, it must be kept secret because ultimately, if I know that death does not exist and that we do not die, and that people who die in a war don't really die, and who people who get killed don't really die because we are eternal, then the pigs The people who are not advanced will start killing people. They'll think, okay, nothing happens. Let's start killing people, and they actually do that. But uh, religious leaders or spiritual leaders know that there are certain teachings that should be kept only strictly among those who are seeking the truth. And then there are many things that involve this path of spirituality, which is really uh, very personal and difficult. So I started researching near-death experiences, also trying to find out why these NDEs are so different yet share common roots. So I noticed the similarity between religions and NDEs because everyone has their own perception of this spiritual world. Okay, and every near-death experiencer that I've talked to comes back with his own story, his own version of truth. Some come saying that yes, Jesus sent them to spread the word, but others say no, I saw Buddha or I saw Krishna. So, uh, what does that mean? That one really did have an experience and the others didn't? No, this means, like I said, that truth is very personal, and people, when they perceive these divine beings or angels, it adapts. It has to adapt to their cultural knowledge, the place they grew in, their characteristics, and somehow this happens automatically. Uh, there was a guy called Xenophanes. He was a Greek. He lived around the time of Buddha. He's not very known. He lived around 500 years before the birth of Jesus. And he said, if dogs and horses had hands and learned how to paint, the dogs would paint their gods as dogs, and the horses would paint their gods as horses. And so he said, some people who are white skinned paint their gods white skin, though there are others who are have dark skin and they paint their gods with dark skin. So he noticed that there is a relativity rule principle behind how we perceive God and these divine beings. It's a reflection of ourselves. That does not mean that they don't exist. The I believe they do exist, but since they belong to another dimension, when we see them, we have to adapt their reality to ours.
Well,
And
mm,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, you think like with heaven and hell, essentially, do we essentially just project, or our higher self projects a certain vision for us? Because like a lot of people have died and they said, I saw a garden and it feels like it was prepared for me. Like maybe their higher self projected it out there to see a garden. And it's like I was listening to this one NDE where this guy was talking about I went to hell and like demons were pouring lava down people's throats, and it was real grotesque. But like the perceptions that people have of hell could be coming from themselves or their higher self and being projected out. One person might experience total darkness in the hell, another person might have demons tearing them limb from limb or pouring lava down their throat. And same thing for heaven. One person might be experiencing a beautiful field, another person might be seeing just white light everywhere. And
Right.
there's been like a couple of NDEs where someone sort of figured that out. Like her name was Nancy, and I don't remember her last name, but she kind of figured out like I could think of one thing, be there, and then I could think of something else, be there, and then I could go back straight to the light, and I could just jump from
Right.
place to place, creating it in my own mind. She kind of figured that out during her near-death experience.
Yes, I've heard about that. Whatever you think happens. So that is like a faculty people have. They PMH Atwater, who is a near-death researcher, had three near-death experiences, and she said she built a whole city with her imagination. You actually everything you think comes true. For example, if you are afraid of something and you go to that place called hell, which is only a name, and it's not really there is no place called hell, but there is a place where we go driven by our own fears because we have not evolved or we feel guilty and we have to face our own fears. Okay. And I'm no expert on this because everything I can say is only a speculation. But I've also heard that as soon as you say, ask for help, for example, God help me, Jesus help me, you leave, you're taken out of that space. So, yes, I've heard that in that dimension, everything you think or desire happens. Uh, but I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert. All I know is that everyone has a different experience because seemingly this adapts to each and every one of us. That's what I mentioned last time. I call it the Tower of Babel syndrome. Everyone who goes up that tower that leads to heaven, when they come back speaking another language, a different language, because they have a unique experience and they come down convinced, for example, that Krishna is the only God and that they will kill for it to defend that knowledge. So it's kind of a strange, and perhaps the real wisdom is to understand that no matter what people experience, it's a projection of themselves, but it's also a projection of those higher beings. Uh, Plato had a story. It's called the story of the cave. Okay, it's another metaphor. It talks about some people who were grew up in a cave, chained, facing a wall, and behind them there was a light. There was light. It could be like a big fire, and when people walked between their backs and the fire, they saw their shadows. So all they could see was the wall of this cave and the shadows of the people that walked by. Or if someone talked to them, they would see the shadow and hear the voice. So they thought that the shadows were actually those beings that were talking to them, and that the only beings that existed were those shadows. So suddenly, one of these guys manages to escape and he leaves the cave. As soon as he leaves the cave, he is blinded by the light because he's been all his life in darkness. So what to us is a normal day, to him it was blinding light, you know. And when he got used to it, he saw, the other people. When he came back to the cave and to try to tell the other people that the shadows were not real, that the shadows were only projections, no one believed him. So that's more or less what happens in near death experiences. These beings that are behind the people who are in the cave are these beings in higher dimensions. They project their shadow to us. I mentioned the example of the people who live in 2D and the people who live in 3D. So right now in 3D, you have this body, but your shadow, which is casted on the ground, is only 2D. So if someone from the second dimension takes a look at Jay, he will see his shadow and he will think that his shadow, which is flat, okay, has no depth, that's the real Jay, the shadow, okay. But you're not the shadow. You are the person or the being who is casting the shadow. In the same way, what we perceive is the shadow of these higher beings, which are in another dimension, and they are projecting their shadows to us, and we mistake the shadows for the beings. Am I expressing myself clearly? But
Mhm.
I think that's what's really going on. When Jesus appears, we are unable to see the real Jesus. All we can see is his shadow, his projection, because we are in this 2D world and he is in a 3D world, and we can only see his shadow. That would be an explanation. But like I said, this is something I this is that's my conclusion. It doesn't have to be real or not. I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's my conclusion. Very personal.
Have you ever wondered whether the Bible was compatible with a near death experience? In my book, Heaven's Truth, the parallels between the Bible and the near death experience, your faith will be strengthened while you support this channel. In Heaven's Truth, you will learn about near death experiences and other similar experiences in the Bible. Support for the Bible contained in NDEs, a central theme that runs through both the Bible and NDEs. How the NDE brings the Bible to life for these modern times, evidence for both the Bible and the NDE, and much more. Great book. Spillers does an excellent job weaving the relationship between NDEs and the scriptures. 5 stars on Amazon, available on Amazon.
One thing that really interested me is near death experiences in children. Why? Because grown ups, when they have a near death experience, okay, they may see Jesus because they were educated to believe in Jesus and they heard about Jesus all their lives. But what about a 1 year old, a 2 year old, a 3 year old? So it's very different. The first case that was studied of an infant or a kid was the case of Crystal Merslock. She was 7 years old and she drowned. And she was resuscitated by a young pediatrician called Dr. Melvin Morse. And when he resuscitated her, uh, he saw her like 1 or 2 weeks later, and he asked her, "Can you tell me what can you tell me about your drowning?" Because they did not know how exactly she had drowned. And she said, "You mean when I was in heaven with the heavenly Father and met Jesus?" And he said, "Wow, what is this? What's going on?" So he started meeting with her, and they started drawing. She started telling him about her experience. And then after this, he said, "Okay, I'm going to study people who have had, uh, whose hearts have stopped and have had clinical death." Okay. So he got a grant and he studied hundreds of kids who were either gravely ill or uh, have been resuscitated to see if he could find anything. And he did find that most of the people who had been resuscitated, like 70% of them had something similar to a near-death experience. Some of them only left their bodies and saw the surgeons working on them. Others did go to a place they called heaven. Others met a being they could call Jesus. One of the kids say he met a wizard, that a wizard helped him come back. But then when he met with the kid 2 weeks later, he said, no, no, it wasn't a wizard, it was Jesus. So obviously his parents told him, look, that was no wizard, that was Jesus. But the amazing thing is that another near-death researcher called PMH Atwater, she did a study with kids from who had an NDE at the time of birth and up to 5 years. Okay, and she interviewed them not at that age. Some were still kids when she interviewed them, but others had grown up. Okay, and what she found after studying 277 people who had had near-death experiences as a child, she found that most of them had experienced something similar to adults, but in a higher percentage. I have some of the statistics here. Another thing she said that is really interesting, it says that while adults take 7 to 10 years to integrate their experience, because most people who have a near-death experience, they don't understand what happened. It takes them years to start talking about it publicly. And if you notice, the people you have interviewed and those whose interviews we can see online, they usually mention that it took them years to decide to start talking about it or to even start understanding what had gone on. So adults take from 7 to 10 years to integrate their experience, but kids, they take from 20 to 40 years to integrate and to understand what happened. PMH Atwater found that kids are more likely to see deceased loved ones more than adults. I'm talking about kids from birth to 5 years old when they had their experience. And most of them, a high percentage of them, saw deceased loved ones. Even people they did not know, and that they introduced themselves to those kids, like for example, hey, I'm your grandfather. And then when that kid grew up and saw the picture of the grandfather, he recognized the guy. That's the guy I met. Okay. There's another thing that happens, or that PMH Atwater detected, that these kids, a high percentage, saw their dead pets, and they talked about animal heaven. So that's really strange, because that's something that perhaps for a kid who is less than 5 years old, I mean, who taught him that? How come different kids from different places say the same things? A lot of them mentioned meeting angels, okay? And amazingly, she found a high percentage of kids who could remember their birth, the moment when they were born. Okay? This is amazing. And what is most amazing is that could some of them could remember when they were in the womb. That's really amazing. One of the persons that PMH Atwater interviewed said that her most profound memory was each time her mother smoked when she was in the womb, and she got really anxious because she knew once she felt the taste, she knew that she was going to get high or dizzy and all that. She would experience the effects. So every time she felt the flavor of nicotine or tobacco, she got a little bit anxious because she knew what was coming. And she remembered this years later. She understood it, and she told PMH Atwood. So that, I think, her findings are super interesting. She said that 85% of the kids, they improved in their abilities solving mathematical problems, and they were also more they had a tendency to like music and were more sensible to music than other kids. Okay. However, there was also a negative side, and it's that a high percentage of kids, they wanted to go back. 21% of them attempted suicide. Not these kids from 1 to 15, but 10 years later, 15 years later, they attempted suicide. 1/5 of those kids. So that's something I've also heard from adults. I recently interviewed Raymond O'Brien, who is an NDE therapist. He works in hospitals helping people to integrate their experiences. And he said that one of the most terrible after effects is that a high percentage of the people he treats, they want to go back. They want to die because they feel better, that they feel that their home is there. And I don't know if you've seen it. I'm sure you have when you've interviewed people who have had near-death experiences. What they say is that I felt like I was at home. You've heard that, right? When they say they go to the other side and they say that they felt like home. So these kids, they actually believe that their home is on the other side. So returning to Dr. Melvin Morse, who did the first study with near-death experiences, there are certain phrases. He worked resuscitating kids in the 1980s when uh, the techniques were very precarious. They were not as evolved as today. And when he did have certain kids that when they got back, when he resuscitated them, they got angry. And they said, "Why did you bring me back?" So that's really strange. One of the kids said, "That was weird. You guys just sucked me back into my body." So that kid, he was amazed because he felt that he had been sucked back. Another said, "I have a wonderful secret to tell you. I was climbing a staircase that went to heaven." So another said, "Forget my body, forget being alive. I just wanted to get to that light, to be with that light." So these are kids, not grown-ups. So they do meet the light. They do go through a tunnel. They do go to these places that look like meadows. They meet these light beings or angels, but hardly any of them have what we know as a life review. However, I one of the NDEs that I interviewed, I think he was 4 years old, which is Jacob Cooper, and he had a life review. But in his life review, he could also remember his past lives. So when he was going through his life review, he was not a little kid. He remembered being an adult, and they showed him his present life, the times he didn't behave properly, whatever. But he was also shown events from his past lives. This is really amazing because it's not usual. There are other things. For example, I've interviewed different near-death experiencers who have their experience when they were little kids. But some of them, for example, Ingrid Honkala, was only 2 years old when she drowned. Her mother, who knew CPR because she was a teacher, had learned that in school, resuscitated her. But before that, Ingrid Honkala left her body because her mother went to work, and when she drowned, her mother was off to work. So she left her body, and what we were talking about happened. She thought about going somewhere, and she was instantly there. So she thought about her mother. She instantly went to where her mother was. She was on her way to catch a bus, and she said, "Oh, mommy!" And her mother, all of a sudden, stopped. She doesn't know why, but she stopped and ran back home because she knew there was something wrong with her daughter. She actually had another sister, but she knew something was wrong with with her daughters. And when she got back, one of them pointed to the tank, the water tank where the other one was drowned. Ingrid, she took her out of the water, apparently lifeless, and she did CPR and she resuscitated her, and she was also sucked back into her body. Now, what happened to her and to many is that when they come back, they sort of develop certain abilities or superpowers. Okay, so her ability was that she started having out of body experiences every time she slept. So this girl actually started sleeping most of the time. She was sleeping and she was going out of her body. And she met some light beings who are still in contact with her today and who guided her all throughout her life. But she was only 2 years old. And then she asked these light beings, why did this happen to me when I was 2 years old? And they told her, look, because you were young enough to not be contaminated, but old enough to remember it. And she spent many years without telling anyone. Her mother told her to don't tell that, don't mention that to people because people are mean. They they could make fun of her, whatever. And she kept that secret to herself until the time came. And now she teaches mindfulness. She actually worked at NASA. She had a very successful life. She worked with the Colombian Navy. She's from Colombia. And also, Jacob Cooper was very young, and he is now a therapist, and he has a very special talents. Other people who had experiences when they were really small, was Mark Anthony. He's a medium, and I think he had three. He was 3 years old when he was sick and died, and he saw the light, merged with the light, and after that, and to this day, he can see deceased people and communicate with the dead. So these are certain things that are unexplainable, but they are really interesting, or at least I find them interesting. So that's basically right now. I'm working on a book about uh, children's near-death experiences, where I want to include more or less everything I've researched and the people I have interviewed. I actually interviewed PMH Atwater about her research. I interviewed Melvin Morse. I interviewed Crystal Merslock, who was 7 years old in 1982 when she died, when she became the first childhood NDE survivor. And so that was 82, 92, 40 years ago. So I also interviewed other researchers like Pim van Lommel, who has done many different studies. Evan Alexander, he had his near-death experience as an adult. Jody Long, I had a good conversation with Jody Long about childhood NDEs, in case you want to have more information. And also with Raymond Moody, Dr. Raymond Moody, and Paul Perry, who is his co-writer. And although they have not written directly about only there's a book which is called The Light Beyond, in which Moody talks about the studies made by Melvin Morse on the importance of childhood near-death experiences. They have not published a book, but Melvin Morse has published several books, also with Paul Perry. Um, so I'm presently finishing this book that I hope to release this year. I hopefully in 1 or 2 months, I will be publishing it. So yeah,
Yeah, I had Melvin. Oh, go ahead.
excuse
Go ahead.
me.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I had Melvin Morris on my show. I talked to him. That was the only one of the group, but yeah, he was pretty interesting.
Yes, he is. He was pretty young when he started doing this, and he said that his fame came because no one else was doing it, and almost by chance, you know, because like I said, he only wanted to know why this girl had drowned, and he asked her, "Do you remember anything about what happened in the pool?" And she said, "You mean when I went to heaven?" Wow! So that started a trend. A lot of people have been studying that. Also, Jeffrey Long, who has the Near Death Research Foundation, um, they have collected quite a lot of cases of childhood near death experiences. And I don't know if anyone else has done. I think there's Bruce Grayson has also written, but not strictly a whole book dedicated to it. PMH Atwater has written several books strictly on childhood NDEs. I highly recommend Melvin Morse and PMH Atwater if you want to go deeper into this subject. And you can, if anyone who's listening wants to know a little bit more, I recommend their books. They are found in Amazon. They are really interesting. Uh, Apart from this, I've been reading a lot because apart from near-death experiences, there is are also other phenomena like Shared death experiences, that's really interesting too. Afterlife communications, that's really interesting. Out of body experiences, I also like that. So there are there's a whole gamma of experiences that have no scientific explanation to this date and that are being studied presently, not by many, but for example, I was reading Dr. Raymond Moody's Glimpses of Eternity. This is an amazing book about shared death experiences. He had a shared death experience with his mother, but he mentions in that book, like, I would say like 30 or 40 different cases, because ever since he published his first book in 1975, a lot of people started contacting him, not only with near death experiences, but also with these afterlife communications and shared death experiences. There was one case in which a woman, her husband had gone out, and she went to sleep, and she had a dream in which she met her husband in this lovely place, full of light. And he told her, I'm not sure if he told her or she sensed that he was dead. And he started moving away, and she started following him. And she wanted to go with him, but he said, "No, no, you cannot come with me. I have to go, but you can't follow him." But she started following him. She paid no attention. And in the end, she said, "No, no, look, you have to stay." She thought it was only a dream, but when she woke up in the morning, she noticed that the, his side of the bed was untouched, and some policemen knocked on the door, and they gave her the news that her husband had been stabbed the night before and killed. So this is amazing because it proves that these experiences, no matter what people say, are not simple hallucinations. They do have an ingredient of hallucination or dream, but they are somewhat real. There's another experience that I took from the Near Death Research Foundation, which is a father and his kid. They went out for dinner, and their car crashed, and they were both taken to the hospital, gravely, about to die both. And the kid had a dream in which he went to heaven and met Jesus. And he said, "Wow, this is amazing. I want to stay here, Jesus. Please let me stay." And he said, "No, I will not let you stay." And he said, "But why? Why?" "Because I gave your father my word. You're not staying." And all of a sudden, his father walks in to the room, or that space, that white blank space. I don't know, heaven. He walks in and he said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" "No, no, I came here to tell you that you have to stay, that you have to go. But I'll stay. I have to stay. But you have to go back to take care of your little brother." He said, "But I have no little brother." And all of a sudden, he woke up. And her mother, he found out later that his father had died in the accident. They came to tell him, and he said, "No, I already know. He told me." And he also knew that his mother was pregnant. So these are cases that, although they do not constitute scientific proof, because scientific proof can only be achieved when you do an experiment X number of times, and all the times you get the same result. Okay? So you cannot conduct a scientific experiment with these experiences. However, the fact that the kid knew that his father had died, or the fact that this woman knew that his husband had died, prove that there is afterlife communication, that there is a that people actually visit heaven, and they prove a lot of things. You know, that there is life after life, that there is a spiritual world, that Jesus or the shadow of Jesus exists, and that there is more to life than what we can appreciate. You know.
Hmm.
So, what
Yeah,
are
there
your
was
own things? Yeah.
there was one from Pam Reynolds, which was kind of close to a scientific experiment because they put her under for surgery and her body was taken down to like 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And, there was all kinds of instruments hooked up. And yet she was able to go out of her body and describe what the doctors were doing and all the different things going on. So that was
Yes.
kind of like she experienced the death experience, but it was through the process of surgery and she was being heavily monitored. And that was kind of like,
Right.
have you heard of
I
Pam
I
Reynolds
think
before?
yes, Pam Reynolds. I don't know if they had to put her in that state of cryogenic. Uh, they put it's like an induced death. They do that when they have to transplant hearts
Mhm.
or when they do have to do brain surgery. They freeze you and they revive you with CPR, right? Something like that. But I'm not. Did you interview her or what? Or is it
Mhm.
just a known
Yeah.
case? You interviewed her.
Oh, no, no. I've just seen videos on YouTube about her. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I've never interviewed her.
she's one of the most famous old time NDEs. You know, one of the first known. Um, but yes, uh, perhaps sometime, or there will come a day when people will be able to experiment. There was this movie about this medical students, that they induced clinical death, and they had these near-death experiences. Uh, I think it's called Flatliners. I don't know if you remember the
Mhm.
movie. If not, you can see it. It's really
Yeah.
interesting. They induced clinical death, and they did have near-death experiences. Each one different, of course. But another thing, I was talking with uh, one of the clinical NDE researchers, and he said that there is a difference between those people who actually have a clinical death in a hospital, who flatline, and those who simply have an experience that they were close to death and they had these experiences, but they did not flatline. I mean, they were not in a hospital. So some other people, like Dr. Yvonne Caissons, defines a near-death experience as an experience that takes place when you are close to death. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to die to have these experiences. And a lot of researchers agree, but others are more strict and say no. Only when there is clinical death you can talk about a near death experience. However, there are as many opinions as researchers in the world. And what I think is that there's a percentage that was mentioned by Melvin Morse, and also by PMH Atwaters and others. And it says that 1 out of 10 people who have a near death who experience a brush with death, or who come close to death, have a near death experience. Okay, so those people, uh, that means 1 out of 10 So there are hundreds of thousands of people only in the United States only who have had near death experiences. And that's why you see so many people now coming out, stepping out of the closet and telling their stories on YouTube and all different social media. Not because this suddenly happened. If you notice, most of these people had their experiences 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and only now they are stepping out and telling their stories. Because in the past, no, hardly anyone knew about it. The term near death experience has only been around since 1975. So, uh, one of the persons I interviewed, Anthony Cipoletti. He had his near death experience in 1946. So it really took him like 20 or 30 years, I'd say 30 years, to understand what had happened to him. And those kids who have near death experiences when they're 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, it takes them decades to learn about near death experiences and to understand that what they had was an NDE. So
Mhm.
I find this fascinating, and I'm going to continue. Another book that I want to write is the Tower of Babel syndrome, explaining why each religion is different and yet has so many commonalities, and why NDEs and mystical visions and dreams are so different yet have so many commonalities. This way, I think I can sort of try to give an explanation to something that has been a mystery up to now, and that it is also one of the reasons why people don't believe in near-death experiences. They say, "Well, how come everyone has a different experience?" So it must be like a dream or a hallucination. But I think it isn't. I did have an afterlife communication with my mother, and also before she died, she was in coma for 2 years, and she visited me in a dream. I had a dream in which she visited me. And I said, "Mother, what are you doing here?" She was supposed to be in coma. She never regained consciousness, and she died shortly after. And she told me, "Look, they gave me permission to come and see you." This was 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. She told me, "Look, they gave me permission." And I asked him, "Who gave you permission?" "The angels." "What do you mean, the angels?" "Yes, I am living in a place that is between life and death. They keep me in a palace, and they treat me like a queen. My people in charge of me are angels, and they tell me I am not allowed, since my body is in coma and has not died, I am not allowed to enter the world of the dead, but I cannot come back to the world of the living because my body is not in shape. So I am in this in between place." She also told me that if I developed my astral body, I could go visit her, and she gave me instructions on how to do that, but I never managed. So she died before I could even, you know, try. And what I think is that years later, I found out what I read about, and I started watching videos of near-death experiences, and I realized that she was in that place where that is visited by near-death.
Yes, the last couple minutes of this podcast cut out. We lost the live feed, but we only went a couple minutes longer than what was there. I'll just close this out and say that I've really found it interesting the last part he was talking about. So basically, if someone is in a coma, where I would assume it's true of a vegetative state, that they live in a spiritual realm, essentially similar to what a near-death experiencer would. So they're not completely in the realm of the dead, but they're not on earth anymore. They're in a spiritual holding place, like spiritual limbo. Often it's heavenly, but it's not the full heaven. But that's just kind of interesting to think about, because if you've ever wondered about what about a person in a vegetative state? What about a person in a coma? Are they really there? And it's like, well, chances are they're not. Now, please do like and subscribe to the channel. Please share it everywhere. Please consider joining my VIP membership club and buy me a cup of coffee. You get special perks and benefits. And you can also give a one-time donation if you'd like to do that. Have you ever wanted to learn to meditate? Watch this. Have you ever wanted to learn to meditate? Check out my book, Meditation for Everyone: How to Quickly Have a More Peaceful, Mindful, and Fulfilled Life, and support this channel. With Meditation for Everyone, you will learn to quickly and easily meditate, relieve stress and anxiety, alleviate depression, and have more joy, peace, and relaxation. What you will learn: mindfulness, the art of stillness, step by step on how to meditate, strategies for overcoming challenges to meditation, and much more. D. Mason said this is a nice meditation book, even for those already meditating. I agree with the statements that it will help to have a more peaceful, mindful, and fulfilled life. 4.6 star rating, available on Amazon.